Good afternoon. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School seminar series. This is another one of the seminars in our series which are trying to drill down on the work of the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations, called Now for the Long Term, this report which there are copies of outside the door. And today we're going to focus on resource issues, which were certainly one of the key areas that we felt in the report required some serious unlocking of the gridlock in global negotiations, in discussions at the national level, and which we also highlight are very integrally connected to issues which arise in other areas, like demographic, like climate, and like many others. So this is clearly an area where interdisciplinary thinking is extremely significant, and where we've been very fortunate in the Oxford Martin School to have a number of different groups who've been doing tremendous work. So the group which Jim is involved in, which is the Natural Resource Stewardship group, the group on the future of food and farming with Charles Godfrey, and others are involved in a group on biodiversity and a group on plants, all amongst the different groups in the Oxford Martin School that work in this space. And there are many others that intersect with it. Today we're going to be trying to reflect on reconciling the human and planetary needs of resources in the future. And we really are fortunate to have three excellent participants in the panel. Jim Hall, who's Professor in Environmental Change Institute and Director of that institute, and is the University Professor of Climate and Environmental Risk in the School of Geography and Environment. His research focus is on management of climate-related issues in infrastructure systems, flooding, coastal erosion, water scarcity. He's a relative newcomer to Oxford, arrived in October 2011, and has really been a great force for a lot of things happening here since then. He's been the lead author on the Office of Science and Technology's Foresight project on flood and coastal defense, and on many other things. Tara Garnett is the principal investigator in the Oxford Martin program on the future of food, and she's the founder of the Food Climate Research Network. She has been very active in many areas, but amongst them the contribution of food systems to greenhouse gas emissions and some of the issues associated with that. And Professor Andrew Hector, who's also a newcomer at Oxford, even newer than Jim, is a professor of ecology in the Department of Plant Sciences, and in this role he's going to be very involved again in many of these interfaces. He comes to Oxford from the University of Zurich, where he was the Professor of Ecology, and prior to that in many other areas in the UK, Imperial College and others, where he has contributed. So a fantastic group of people. The way we're going to run this is I'm going to ask them each to give about 5 minutes of initial thought on the topic, not least on having read the report Now for the Long Term. We'll have a little panel discussion, and then we'll open it up. So, Jim.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. And let me begin by congratulating you and your fellow commissioners on Now for the Long Term, not least for its catchy title, but also for the skill with which it wove together such a diversity of themes in relation to resources, governance, society, technology, geopolitics, and then navigated that towards some very practical and compelling recommendations for the future. Over to you for the construction of a new global consensus on human values. That was perhaps the most ambitious one, but the most important perhaps. I mean, water spans very much the scope of the Commission's work. Obviously, it's an issue of resource security, deeply embedded in issues of governance, technology, society, in particular with respect to demand for water resources, strong connections with health issues. And one of the challenges associated with water is the way in which we integrate those different dimensions of such a complex and multidimensional problem. Within Oxford, over the last few years, we've been developing the framing around water security as being one of the ways in which we can pull those different dimensions together. In fact, just let me do a quick advertisement for an issue of the Field Trends of the Royal Society, which just appeared this month, based on a conference we had last year here in Oxford on water security, risk and society, and one of the early outputs of the Oxford Martin Programme on resource stewardship. There's a paper in there, Ian, you'll be pleased to see. But we think of water security as being a tolerable level of risk to society. So water security is looking at water from the point of view of the potential harmful effects that water may have from a number of different perspectives. So not only in terms of water shortages, but issues in terms of flooding, inadequate water supply and sanitation, issues of ecological degradation in water resource systems as well. And we tend to notice water when one of those harmful effects materializes. On the whole, water is not so noticeable when we've got what we need. And this was a problem which puzzled Adam Smith, in fact, the notorious diamond water paradox, that we have a greatly value water when it's absent, but we don't value it in large quantities. And that was eventually resolved in economics with the idea of marginalism. So we have rapidly decreasing marginal values for water. On the whole, then, our decisions around water are, we refer to as being satisficing. We try and achieve a satisfactory level of risk across a whole number of different dimensions. And that's the way in which we think about water security. And in situations of competing claims for water, in communities, between nations, between society and the environment, on the whole, we're looking for some satisfactory, least worst outcome as far as all of those parties are concerned. How have different countries responded to the challenges of water security? Looking around the world, we see combinations of the responses which usually bring together some package of institutions, infrastructure investment. So by institutions, we're thinking about water allocation, mechanisms for regulation, market mechanisms, infrastructure, storage, irrigation, transfers, water supply and sanitation. And increasingly, we're seeing a reliance on trade in water-intensive commodities, primarily food, which is something which Tara will be talking about in a moment, as a means for compensating for local shortages, and an increasing emphasis on restoration of the aquatic environment. So few things like the Water Framework Directive in Europe through the river restoration movement in North America. So a number of approaches have been tried in the past, and I think we're learning from the success and failure of those approaches. What might we consider for the future? What new models are there out there? And I would begin with first recognising the enormous potential we have to understand the aquatic system much better than we're used to in the past through observations, through sensing, through satellites, through embedded sensors in water resource systems, our ability to model that system ubiquitously, to share those models with stakeholders all over the world, and to also understand much more about the human dimensions of water resources, and that chimes with the WorldStat notion which comes through the Commission's report. So I think we're in a fantastic position to understand and provide the knowledge required to manage the system better. We should be emphasising investment, because there's been huge underinvestment in many parts of the world, and exploring new sources of finance, and that's another issue which the Commission's report touches upon. There's increasing interest in new market instruments, in particular around pricing, around trading, around the involvement of the private sector, and trying to align interests in that respect. We should be prioritising ecosystem services, so in watershed protection, in fisheries, and very much to conclude in the flavour of the Commission's report, it's absolute necessity to plan for the long term. Let me close with the example of Singapore as an instance of water resource planning for the long term. Singapore is a controversial place in some respects, but in terms of water resources planning, I think it's a remarkable exemplar of how they've recognised the long-term risks to which they were exposed with respect to their water supply, have thought about that problem in the long term, put together packages of some very innovative technologies around direct reuse of water, around desalinization from ice slurries, from the regasification of LNG, and have also put in place the governance and institutional structures so that 60% of the water which falls on the urban area in Singapore is used directly in the water supply system. And when the Environment Minister from Singapore, who was here in Oxford last year, was asked, well, how did you do that? And he said, well, A, we fought for the long term, and B, we did exactly what you taught us to do in the Harvard Business School, which was analyse, appraise, tear this thing apart ruthlessly in order to make the right investment decisions.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Tara.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to give my take on the food element in the report. So I think that the elements that came up most prominently for me were what we ought to do about food production, so that's agriculture, and then the impacts that food has upon our bodies, and that's health. And in both respects, it was good to see what had been written. So when it came to agriculture, there was a focus on sustainable intensification, which at its simplest is the idea of producing more food with less environmental impact, and perhaps from a more nuanced perspective, providing better food that is nutritious rather than just stuff, calories, but with regard to the multifunctional character of landscapes, the fact that it's not just about producing food, but it's also about maintaining ecosystem services and water and so on and so forth. I thought that was great, and I thought there was also a very clear focus on rising burden of chronic diseases, obesity, and so on and so forth in developing as well as in developed countries. What I found perhaps most surprising was that the report didn't connect those two aspects at all. So what I would have liked to have seen more of in the report, firstly, was a questioning of the idea that with a population that's set to reach 9 to 10 billion by 2050, that it was absolutely obvious that we need to, say, double our food production or increase it by 70 to 100%, the figures vary, rather than saying, well, hang on a minute, we've also highlighted the fact that waste is a major concern, and that obesity is linked to overconsumption par excellence, and therefore perhaps we need to be looking at the environmental implications of excessive consumption, and in particular of resource-intensive excessive consumption. And again, I don't think I saw the word meat come up in the report, and I think this is a convergence issue where you have on the one hand the food system accounting for, well, take your pick with the figures, between 15 and 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and livestock contributing to about 50% of those impacts, as well as its demand for water and huge users of land in both good but often very bad ways. And then you have the fact that meat is both energy dense and also fat dense, and that if you were to join the dots in many contexts, in developed and also in transition economies, you might actually achieve a double win. So I thought that was potentially a missed opportunity. And I saw it echoed, and I'm not a great, I don't know much about transport, but I noticed there was this emphasis on fit cities, which is great. But again, the link between energy efficiency in the urban environment, transport, more efficient modes of transport, but less emphasis, as far as I could see, on walking and cycling. And again, I think a bit of joining the dots there would have been really interesting. And I think what was also something that came out was, what I really liked about it was this idea that we need to have a shared vision, and we need to emphasize visions and values, and look at I think the phrase used was creative differences, and I thought that was really interesting. But I think something that could be done quite usefully in the long term is to say, well, we really need to look at these in, not just in a sort of motherhood and apple pie way, but in very concrete terms. So if you take the food system, everybody wants a sustainable food secure system. I mean, who could possibly disagree with that? But we often have very, very different views on what we mean by sustainability, what we mean by an adequate nutritious diet, where the roles of preferences and demands come into it, rather than perhaps a more egalitarian, fair share vision of, what constitutes acceptability. So I think some of the shared values that we need to be exploring, as well as what the creative differences are views on notions of growth and increased consumption, and where we should actually start to question that, where our demand for certain foods needs to be perhaps balanced by what everybody needs, which might not be the same thing, what the role of livestock and animal production is in a sustainable food future, what the role is of agriculture and development. So again, going back to the sustainable intensification section, it pointed out that agriculture is essential for sustaining human rural livelihoods, but livelihoods in rural areas are changing. So what is the role of agriculture in contributing to growth and development, going beyond economic definitions of what we mean by development? And then the balance that is to be struck between technological innovation, obviously very important, and efforts to change behaviour, and perhaps more robust things we could be doing around that, rather than handing out leaflets and awareness raising and all that sort of thing. And again, what the balance is between individuals taking responsibility for their diets, their transport decisions, or whatever it is, and what the role is of the state, and what our collective responsibilities are in changing that. And then finally, there was a mention of business for the long term, and again, with the food system, that's food businesses are very aware that they need to be planning ahead for the long term. And I think that perhaps raises questions not just about what sorts of foods they should be producing and with what impact and produced by whom, but also what the role is of what we mean by growth, and whether more profits and more of the same is actually what we ought to be doing. So I think that's about it.
Thanks, Tara. Andrew.
So I'd like to introduce biodiversity and the role of biodiversity, or the view of biodiversity presented in the report, and how biodiversity links to the other issues we're going to be discussing today, by looking at how quickly that's changed. So if you go back to the time of Darwin, Wallace and their contemporaries, then that was very much the age of discovering biodiversity, and the big issue was how it had evolved, how it came about. And it's only really quite recently, in the mid-1990s, that people began to worry about the ongoing loss of biodiversity, and in particular the consequences that that would have for ecosystems and for the environment. And I think the reason for that is fairly obvious, that the loss of biodiversity has been accelerating and relatively recent, and there's a time lag before that's really appreciated. But it's really, the point is that our ideas about biodiversity are having to change very rapidly. And the sort of framework within which we're working at the moment is then it very much views our ecosystems as machines, if you like, that function. They perform various processes, they function. And the species, if you like, biodiversity, species are parts in this machine. And we know that we're, at least in many cases, we're losing biodiversity. And the question is what that's doing to the integrity, to the functioning of the machine, of our environment. And so that's this concept of sort of ecosystem functioning in general. Of course, we derive many benefits from the natural world. And so the report introduces a concept that was really popularized by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, of this concept of ecosystem services. So these are the benefits that we gain from the natural environment, and of course in many cases do not pay for and do not place a direct monetary value on, and are often subject to things like the tragedy of the commons and so on. And so the framework that's really presented in the report, which is very much one of the major frameworks in ecological science at the moment for trying to link biodiversity with humanity, if you like, is this concept of ecosystem services. And I really think there's two sides to the biodiversity issue, really, if I try and link to water, food, and the other issues that are covered in the report. So on the one side, if we look at the most recent assessment of biodiversity a few years ago, of the success of the Convention on Biological Diversity, was sadly fairly negative, concluding that by and large we failed to slow the rate of biodiversity loss. And what we really need, so on the one side, what we need to do is to really look at the impacts of food, of water, and so on biodiversity, and to try and think how we can produce food, provide clean water, and so on, while minimizing the impacts on biodiversity. But there's another side, and the other side is the role that biodiversity could actually play in these systems. So for example, if we go back to water, trying to make a link there, there's a famous example with, I think in New York State, where rather than building new water plants, the decision was made to protect some of the Catskills Mountains as a watershed instead of building more plants. Similarly, at the moment with linking to food, there's very much an initiative to try and think, how can we integrate, other ways we can integrate biodiversity into the food production system. And I guess just to finish, I should emphasize, I've talked about species a lot. When we mention biodiversity, we're often thinking about species. But of course, it's broader than that. So we might be talking about genetic resources, genetic diversity, or sometimes even up on the landscape scale and the diversity of the landscapes that we live in. So it's really, I think, if I focused on one thing that really links biodiversity with water, food, and the other issues covered in the report, it's this concept of ecosystem services and the role that biodiversity can play in providing those services.
Great. Well, we've had perspectives on water, food, and biodiversity. And I think where the Oxford Martin Commission is trying to make a difference is talking not only about the analytics, but on the so what. So what are the 2 or 3 things you would do if you could, which are ambitious but practical to achieve these goals. And what I want to just push all 3 of the speakers to do is to just say, and not necessarily from the recommendations that are in here, if they have others, that's fine too. What what would you do as your number sort of 1, 2, and 3 priorities to actually make things happen? What do you think we should go and do as citizens? What do you think Oxford should do? What do you think the UK should do? What should others do to try and achieve sustainability of outcomes for next generations in these 3 dimensions? Jim, first.
In relation to water resources and water infrastructure, both on very broad scales in catchments, also in urban areas in terms of water supply and sanitation, a huge amount is happening in any case, and much of that is due to rapidly emerging economies recognizing the importance of water security and investing in that. After a dip in the investment in large water-related infrastructure, that's taking off. In relation to water and sanitation, actually, this is one of the areas where the Millennium Development Goals are heading in the right direction, and we see sanitation in a timescale perhaps not as quick as it should be, but on the timescale of, say, 20 years or so, no longer being the global priority. It's a issue that's going in the right direction. So the critical question, as far as I'm concerned, then, is making the right choices along that development trajectory. That there are the world is scattered with bad projects, bad investment, which have been harmful for the environment. They've burdened countries with debt. They haven't yielded the returns in terms of benefit for society, communities, the economy that were expected. And so the contribution that can be made is in terms of providing the evidence, the information, the capacity for decision making to make better choices. Some of that comes, as I hinted in my introduction, in terms of the ubiquitous availability of knowledge and making that much more widely available. Some of it comes through the educational mission of institutions like Oxford and elsewhere to promote understanding of those processes of good decision making.
What I would like to see is more of a bridging role in facilitating discussions about, firstly, consumption patterns and diet. So what we ought to be heading for, how people feel differently about this, and what the role of sustainable diets are in helping us reduce the environmental impacts associated with our food consumption patterns. And I think that links to a much bigger and harder question about consumption in general, and what and if there are limits to consumption, and what we mean by sustainable consumption. Again, does sustainable consumption just mean smarter, the substitution of cleaner for dirtier products? Does it mean different kinds of consumption, or does it just mean less? And I think we need to have a really serious think about what that means. And also in a bridging role to also try and engage in conversations with newly affluent populations in transition economies, and also in the minor subsections of low-income countries as well, about what the future trajectories are there, and whether continued growth is what we really want as a society. So I feel awkward questions are what might be useful.
So when you say we, what do we want? Let me ask you 2 questions about that. So who's we? I mean, do you think that we is the same here as in Burkina Faso? And so who's the we? And the second question is, what do you want?
Okay. So I think the we here, I'm talking about the Oxford Martin School and a potential role for the Oxford Martin School in that. What do I personally want? I think I want less consumption.
For yourself or for the whole world?
For myself and for other people who are as affluent as me.
Right, we'll come back to some of these, but thank you. Andrew.
Right, on biodiversity, well, I mentioned the assessment that we've largely failed to slow the rate of biodiversity loss set by the Convention on Biological Diversity. So I think really what we need is more than just target setting per se is clearly no good if there's no mechanisms by which to try and achieve those goals. And so I think that's one thing that policy clearly needs to do. There's no good just setting unrealistic goals. There's got to be a more joined up thinking about a way to actually achieve those goals. We now have a new intergovernmental policy platform for biodiversity and ecosystem services, so that's a hopeful development, and we'll see where that leads. And I think the other thing I'd like to mention is a lot of policy is based really on opinions and not much evidence. That's sometimes because the evidence doesn't exist, and so there's no choice but to do what seems like the most sensible path forwards. But I think what I would also like to see, speaking from my experience as a researcher, trying to work with people more in the real world, if you like, or outside the research community, is that what's a shame is when we try and do things and then we collect very little good scientific evidence about the success or failure. So even where there's an absence of evidence in the past and nothing to really base something on, it's a real shame if we then spend a lot of money, put a lot of effort into doing things, and yet, again, fail to actually collect any good information. So in other words, what I'm talking about is that I think a strong role for evidence-based conservation of biodiversity.
So we had on the commission Julian Martin Lefebvre, who's the head of Conservation International, or IUCN, International Union of Conservation. We had a senior Chinese minister. We had quite a range of people. And what I'd be interested in your views as to whether, I think Tara, you said there's some things that some links we didn't make between, say, energy systems and transport systems and cities, or between nutrition and food systems, etc. And I think that's very fair point. But are there areas in biodiversity that you feel we sort of missed a big picture story that we should have talked about that you would have liked to have seen in the report?
I think it's in some ways when we tend to think about biodiversity, your mental picture that pops into your mind is of a tropical rainforest or so on. And yet, of course, nowadays, much of biodiversity is not in pristine systems. There's, well, arguably none of the planet anymore is unaffected by human activity, right? So more and more biodiversity is what we see around us outside our windows and so on. So actually, I think what needs to be done is actually biodiversity needs to be integrated into the thinking about water, food, and so on, so cities and so on. What's the role of biodiversities in future cities, and where does that fit in? And so I think it's an integration, and obviously that's something the Oxford Martin School can play a key role in facilitating.
Great. So do any of the panel have any questions for the panel members before we open it up? Yeah.
I have a question. It's about integrating biodiversity into food production, and of course that links up to that whole can of worms about land sparing versus land sharing. I was wondering where you stood on all that.
I think so. Just for the audience, so this is the debate about which is the best way to go for biodiversity. Should we have more extensive agriculture that's more sort of biodiversity friendly, if you like, but may then be less productive and require more area to be converted to agriculture? Or should we try and really concentrate agriculture onto the smallest area possible and make it as efficient and as productive as possible, and spare as many other areas that we can leave for biodiversity? And actually, I tend to, to go back to my last point, rather than trying to be, to have particular hard views on that, I think it should be whatever's best for biodiversity. And it's quite possible that might differ from system to system. So that might be different somewhere like Europe, for example. Much of our biodiversity, it's biodiversity that has grown up with humanity over thousands of years. And whereas if you contrast that to more far-flung parts of the world with much lower population densities, then there the biodiversity might need essentially protecting from more protecting from interactions with humanity. But I think it should be evidence-based. We should, rather than trying to say it should be one or the other, we need to really do the science that's possible to try and work out what's best and implement the best system for the area as appropriate.
Okay. Who would like to pose the first question? If it's to a particular panel member, say so. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Wait for the mic.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, of course, and I know you're working very hard on this and, you know, have got some very good new ideas, which I hope will lead to something. But what I'm thinking of, and this is the third seminar I've been to this week here, and there's always something that isn't there, which is that you kind of, as a given, is that somehow there's going to be a population of 10 billion in 2050. There's absolutely nothing we can do about it, and we must therefore get all resources ready to meet this huge population. It's got to be either nuclear power, or it's got to be lots of water, or you know, so on. And I think really this is a big miss in yours. It's like an elephant in the room that nobody dares talk about. Because actually there are 37 years still to 2050, which is more than a generation. And there are lots of small children and teenagers who needn't be producing lots and lots of kids in sub-Saharan Africa or wherever. There are still very big families. And you know, when I first got into ecology,
can you ask
yes, I'm going to ask a
question.
question. Yeah. There was, you know, in the 70s, people did think about family planning, and Oxfam, when I worked there then, had family planning, big, you know, education and providing facilities. And don't you think that actually all your problems about resources would be solved if we could have actually think, oh, we're not going to have an vast increase in population. And of course, one other thing is, what about, I mean, it's supposed to be resources, human and planet, and I don't like the idea of biodiversity being just systems for human beings. I mean, the planet needs those other ecosystems for its own life, you know, and human beings are just part of the ecosystem. And don't you think it should be less anthropocentric? Anyway, there's a question.
Okay, so I'll ask all three of the, so I think it's a very important point, all three of the panelists to comment on the population dynamics of this and whether there are assumptions. I don't think there are. I would also stress that don't judge the Oxford Martin School by the seminars that happen here. Every week there's a seminar in the cinema room downstairs from our Institute of Population and Aging. Okay, so there's at least one seminar a week on just demographics and aging, which you can go to if you're interested.
Aging. What about
demographics?
Youth.
Demographics.
Tell young people.
Okay, who'd like to go first on this?
Yes, I'll weigh in then first. First of all, well, so I can say that yes, my implication was not that we should view biodiversity just as something for the immediate good of humanity. I think, and that is one criticism actually of the ecosystem concept, is that ecosystem services concept, sorry, is that what if many species do not provide obvious large benefits to humanity in the particular scheme that you're trying to assess them by? Does that make them worthless? And so I don't think so. Lots of people criticize the scheme for that reason. My view is I don't see the ecosystem services scheme as an alternative to other views of biodiversity. I see it as complementary. So I think there's all sorts of reasons to preserve biodiversity. Many of them have been around for a long time, so that, you know, ideas, various ethical, religious ideas about it being just wrong to destroy biodiversity because it has its own right to exist for its own sake, or that we will deprive future generations, or that we gain, you know, we would conserve it just as we would want to conserve great paintings and so on. That's, you know, in a way, nature is this wonderful work of art and so on. And I think all of those views can coexist alongside the ecosystem services scheme. I don't see the ecosystem services scheme as an alternative to those views. So that was just to address one of your points. And then your question was really about population. I think there's sort of good and bad sides to that. I think, you know, it probably is fairly inevitable that we are going to see substantially larger populations, and we probably are going to, you could almost view it as sort of a bottleneck in a way. Hopefully, maybe we've got this, these few decades ahead of us where human populations will grow, and probably our ecological footprints will grow, and that will place biodiversity under increasing pressure. But on the other side, there's a very good news story on the demographic side, on the population biology side, which is that, you know, many sort of things that we observe in science are not that repeatable, but the one feature that is very repeatable is that as societies sort of develop in inverted commas, then birth rates almost always fall, and that's been, I think, universally observed. And so we have very good reasons to believe that while the population is probably going to substantially increase in the near future, beyond that, it will level off and fall.
I'm going to pass most of this question on, in part for good reasons, in the sense that on the water demand side, essentially this is a food question as well, because 70% of the world's water resources are used in agriculture. So if there's an implication from population increase, it is mediated through food. So that one goes to Tara. And the second part I'm going to suggest passing on, if I may, Chairman, is to Professor Dorling, who I'm not sure whether that was amongst the seminars you've been to recently, was around population, and he's a few rows behind you now. And who's looked much more carefully at population than I have. The only comment I'd make on the demand side with respect to water, and again I think this would probably echo what Tara might say with respect to food as well, is noting the incredible wastefulness with respect to how we use water resources, both in advanced economies and elsewhere in the world. And so there is huge potential to use our resources more efficiently. And the other feature with water is it's where you are that matters. And so even that resource constraint is very location specific.
My views on population have recently been reformulated by watching something on the telly. I feel that population is certainly a concern, and if you look at the trajectories in demand for food, the estimated, anticipated increases are partly because of the more mouths to feed, as well as partly the different consumption patterns. So it's an equal thing. But my understanding is that birth rates are slowing, that the average your average Bangladeshi woman has 2.5 children, which I found was an astonishing statistic, where I would have thought it would be much higher, and that a lot of the inevitability of population growth is due to the fact that the people who are going to be producing their 2 children in coming generations have already been born. So that population is certainly something to address from a feminist point of view, from reproductive health, all the rest of it, as well as from a resource point of view and an environmental point of view, but that to an extent it's already happening.
Danny, do you want to say something? And just get the mic. Huh?
I can say something. Over half of the increases,
why don't you grab the mic?
Half of the increase to 9 or 10 billion is our children not dying young, and hence living longer. The other half is still to slow down in babies. It's another generation till we get down to 2. But I'll ask my question. Just got the mic.
Yeah. Just 1 second before you ask the question. there are two things I'd encourage you to look at, one now and one in the future. There's a great BBC Two show with Hans Rosling
Don't panic.
on this issue, which I looked at last night actually and thought was tremendous, and I can see you shaking your head, but I thought it was fantastic. The second thing is a plug for my forthcoming book, which is coming out in the spring, so I'll remind you then. But it's called Is the Planet Full? And it's an interdisciplinary edited volume on exactly this topic. And there are some authors in the book, not least the ethical philosophers, who argue that actually there's a deep ethical problem with trying to cut other people's populations. And I'll encourage. Anyway, wait till the book comes out and we'll have a debate here. You had a question.
The question. I saw an image recently of a residential block planned to be built in Mumbai for the super rich. And it's a skyscraper. And on every balcony, there wasn't a balcony, there was a glass swimming pool. So each person had their own private swimming pool. And it was many, many dozens of stories high. And what it made me think to two things. One is, should we rely on the price mechanism to let, if people can afford to buy water in Mumbai, should they be allowed to buy as much as they can? And secondly, is there anything to be said for trying to encourage people not to live in areas or increase in areas away from water? So wouldn't it make sense for Singapore to stop its population at this point rather than become even more efficient? Is there something special about Singapore that means that many people need to be crowded there? So it's two questions. One is, should you be allowed to fill up your swimming pools as much as you want if you can pay for it? And should we allow people to move to places even if there isn't water where they're moving to?
Whether one should be allowed to consume as much water as you like if you can pay for it, I think that the starting point for that is that in most parts of the world, and I'm guessing here, but I'm pretty sure that that would include Mumbai, one's not even paying a reasonable price for the water that you're actually using. And that the technology, for example, the metering isn't in place to enable the type of pricing structure which would provide reasonable disincentives to overconsumption. And we don't have that in this country either. We don't have, even in the water scarce southeast of this country, we don't have universal metering, so one can't put in place a pricing structure which gives everyone a reasonable amount of water for hygiene and hydration, and then progressively charges an increasing tariff for large or excessive amounts of water use. Both of your questions kind of point to a fairly dirigiste view of the way in which we plan our societies with respect to natural resources. And that doesn't really square up with what I observe happening in terms of urban planning and infrastructure development around the world. What we are observing, and you might have seen a very interesting article in Nature just last month around climate-related conflict and migration, that migration is already taking place in relation to climate stresses, and water resources is the most visible climate stress that we observe. So my perception would be that this relocation with respect to water resource scarcity is happening in an unplanned rather than a planned way.
Yeah. Can I just throw in two questions to supplement that, Jim? The one is, when you have money, you can do anything with water. So the biggest migrations in the US are to Arizona, where there's no water, and people pump it deeper and further. And the second in Europe is the big migrations to southern Europe, where there's no water. So there's no evidence that when you have high incomes, that water is anything other than perverse, because it's such a tiny share. And the second question is, I mean, isn't the answer in Singapore is that, of course, they've got a lot of water, they're surrounded by ocean. Desalination costs are 50 cents a cubic meter, which is much less than the water that we drink out of bottles here. And therefore, there's absolutely no water issue. They'll just desalinate. It's an energy issue.
It is. If you're near the sea, water is an energy issue. I think the point to make with respect to Singapore is that is one of the places where consumers do bear the full cost of water. And then for people who are disadvantaged by that, they have income support mechanisms. So you get the price disincentive comes through the consumption comes through your water bill, and then they deal with the societal inequalities by other mechanisms.
Okay, who else has questions or comments? Yeah. Sorry, just wait for the mic.
Thanks. I'd like to first of all comment on what Tara said and encourage the use of linkages, and for the Oxford Martin School to think out of the box a bit. And as an attempt to that, I would like to ask all of the panelists, I mean, imagine if you were a bee, you had a choice. You could either be a domesticated bee, which we use and produce obviously for agriculture, or a wild bee. And what would you then think of this discussion, and what would your concerns be? For example, if we are going to need the resources of the wild bees, as we know, in order to maintain when we have the current dreadful situation in bees, and so on and so forth, just think, or imagine, if I was a clown, how would I feel? All these sort of alternative approaches. So, first of all, if you could just answer that, and what would be your concern, particularly about biodiversity, about water access to, and about food, your role in, and so on?
Well, that's a tough one. I spend most of my working time trying to think like a plant, not like a bee, so that's quite a challenge. But yes, I think it brings up an interesting point around ecosystem services, because obviously one of those services is pollination. But pollination can be done in various ways. So it can be done by honeybees, which are, of course, natural organisms, but they're being kept by people, of course, or by wild pollinators. Of course, in a sense, it's a monoculture issue, in a way, with honeybees, because you've just got this, and as you'll all be aware from the newspapers and so on, there are all sorts of, there's colony collapse disorder and various explanations for that through parasitism, disease, and pesticides, and all sorts of competing explanations for exactly what's going on. But so the point I want to make, though, is then to come back to the wild pollinators, which actually sometimes can be more effective than honeybees as pollinators anyway. It depends how you view on it, really. I mean, in California, for the pollination of the almonds, they literally ship around lorry load after lorry load of honeybees around the country to pollinate as the climate moves and it's time for the pollination. So in a sense, you could say, well, we don't need wild nature because we've replaced it. We've replaced it with the honeybee, and we can do that pollination ourselves. But what if you get a particularly bad outbreak of colony collapse disorder, and then you might have pollination failure? And that hasn't tended to happen yet. So the almond crop isn't yet limited by pollination, but that's not to say that couldn't happen at some point in the future. And so the one way to look on these wild pollinators is then as a kind of an insurance. And of course, there are many good reasons to conserve the land and the biodiversity that supports the wild pollinators, but we can also see that as having a potential value to us and providing this additional pollination service all the time and this insurance value in the face of problems in the future. So that would be my thoughts as a bee.
Yeah, good.
Andy's already referred to the some of the ecosystem service connections with water resource systems. Over the years, some terribly destructive things have been done in pursuit of efficiency in water resources, and we're coming to recognise the contributions that preserving the natural environment make to preserving these systems. One of the things that I do a lot of work on is in relation to coastal flooding, and there we're getting much better at valuing the effects that coastal habitats have in reducing flood risk in flood-prone areas, reducing wave heights at coastal structures, and so reducing the amount we have to do in order to protect and preserve those systems. So there's a lot to learn there, but I'd like to think that our water resource systems in future contain much more in the way of recognition and preservation of those ecosystem services than they do at the moment.
May I just comment about for example, about the Namibian fog-basking beetle? Do you know about that project in the Sahel?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
Oh, sorry. So in areas in the Sahel, obviously, it gets terribly cold at night. And a colleague of mine noticed the way Namibian fog-basking beetles manage to collect their water supply by berry meadows. So, without take up all your time, somebody came up with the idea of a lot of plastic brooms, which exactly replicate what a beetle does. And so there's a large area of Libya which now has irrigated tree crops. But I just want to say you didn't sound, either of you so far, much like a bee, and you haven't told me whether you'd rather be domesticated or wild.
Tara.
Right, okay, so there's the well-known fable of the town mouse and the country mouse, which is sort of what you're getting at, and it's the perennial problem, and I live in London, and it's lovely to get out, and then I'm scuttled back home to Finsbury Park after a few days, because that's where I come from. But so I think what's interesting about what you're saying is that actually we need to bring together people who have these very different views on what's a good life, really. But I think you're also making a point sort of about resilience and about whether you hedge your bets and you sort of optimize among various variables, or you sort of achieve a compromise among various variables, or whether you sort of go to say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to max out on this, and I'm going to somehow take out insurance on the other things by another route. So again, I think that raises the question of what the relationship is between resilience in a system where you may not get very high yields, or you may not get the best, most precious kind of biodiversity, however you want to define it, or whatever, and where you say, right, I'm going to have pristine environment here, and I'm going to have maximum food production there. And also what the space is that where you have to make these decisions, where in a sense people can take the slack. So if you're competing between food production and optimal biodiversity, you can say, well, actually, if we consumed a bit less, we needn't have to make that trade-off. So I think, yeah, I'm not sure if that answers.
You didn't find out which buzz you're going to get, but you got 3 very good answers. Was there a hand on this side? Go with that side, then. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I ask a question about land? Because that doesn't feature in the report as far as I can see. It seems to be the kind of cornerstone both for ecosystem services, food, the water side of things. I'm quite interested to get people's views on our land ownership structures. Are they significant? How should they be considered within this concept?
Who'd like to start? Do you want to start, Jim?
I was going to pass that on
Okay.
to Tara.
I think land is really interesting and really difficult. And I've been doing a bit of work in China at the moment where it's very pertinent, the idea that maybe a better way of using land is to scale up, and that will require reform of the current land tenure system. And again, it raises all these difficult questions as to whether you get ecologies of scale, or whether somehow by doing that you get into those risks of, I suppose, moral hazard, as it were. By scaling up, do you maximise your profits, increase your clout and power, and therefore have the ability to kind of flout or erode any land governance structures? So with sustainable intensification, does it mean that you can just, you know, pay a bit of backsheesh or whatever to get doubling of the land area, so you've negated all those gains? So I think what we do about land and who owns it is really important, but I don't think I've got any answers.
Just to dive in briefly with respect to water, I mean, when we read headlines about land grabs, that's often, in fact, water grabs is what it's about, is trying to find resource-rich lands in areas where the governance structures around water are not particularly strong, and so arrangements for allocation of water, and particular allocating enough water to the environment is not well established. So alongside the governance structures in land, that has to be coupled with governance structures in relation to water.
Well, just a few thoughts, I suppose. One, if you think about conservation of biodiversity, you know, one pathway that's often used by somebody like the RSPB, for example, is they've done a lot of just buying up of land that they can then manage, and then of course they sometimes have the debate about how should that land then be managed just for a particular species, or just birds, or a particular species of birds even, or how do they balance that with managing it for biodiversity in the wider sense? Where you don't have private ownership and land is more, there's more common access, then of course you have the tragedy of the commons. How do we come up with schemes to avoid over-exploitation and avoid this tragedy of the commons? And I guess the other view, coming back to something that's mentioned in the report, another concept that I'd like to mention in regards to biodiversity and ecosystem service is this, I mentioned ecosystem functioning. Of course, we usually don't want landscapes to just provide one particular function, like carbon storage or food provision or water provision or so on, but we usually want them to perform multiple functions. And so that's one of the concepts that we're struggling with at the moment, is this concept of ecosystem multifunctionality. How do we get a given piece of land to provide the many things that we want it to do?
And I think that applies to health as well. So obviously physical health, mental health, good access to natural land is a huge asset in those terms. I think that link can be made in here as well. So think about it as a positive provider to society as well as system services.
Okay, the hand, was the hand there, and we need to walk all the way around, but that's all right. Thanks, Clara.
Thanks. About 15 years ago, a colleague of mine at Stanford, Jeff Pfeffer, published a wonderful book called The Knowing-Doing Gap. So while we accumulate critical knowledge about the systems, biodiversity, food and water, we push important system parameters going forward. So I'm wondering, how much time do we really have left until we run into important tipping point dynamics? What do we know about tipping points in your systems? And can we actually still reverse dynamics, or are we already in the process of runaway dynamics from which we cannot return?
Yeah, I 2 or 3 years ago did a major expert elicitation around the probability of tipping points in the Earth system. I hope it's the last expert elicitation exercise I do in my career, because it was a painstaking process, and unfortunately it didn't come up with particularly compelling results, because I think that the deeper you dig the notion of a tipping point, the more it unravels, in that phenomena which at first glance seem to switch on and off actually have multiple causal factors, and though those causal factors may be non-linear, the response is by no means sudden. Andy might have views on this in relation to ecosystem response. In relation to water, I've already stressed the spatial variability of water, and the water cycle will persist come what may in terms of what we do to the Earth system. Most immediate concerns are in terms of unsustainable exploitation of groundwater resources, which is getting to absurd scales in places like northern China. And there, in a sense, I think one can think of having passed tipping points in the sense that the rate of exploitation is way in excess of the rate of recharge.
Do you want to comment?
Maybe as biodiversity was raised there, I should follow up. It's very much an issue in terms of biodiversity loss as well, whether it's a question of sort of passing thresholds and alternative stable states where systems could quickly flip. We know from basic ecology that is sometimes possible. On the other hand, it could be what we're looking at is more of, if you like, death by 1,000 cuts, where it's just a gradual loss of species and a sort of incremental and accelerating loss of function to ecosystems. It's still very much a bit of an open question. People have looked at, I don't think it's covered in the report, this concept of planetary boundaries, and so how close we are to the limits of various planetary boundaries. And certainly in that assessment, I think it's very much kind of an expert crystal ball gazing, but in that assessment, biodiversity was one of the planetary boundaries that was in most trouble, shall we say.
Great. Yeah. Sorry. Wait for the mic.
So this is a question for Jim and Tara at the intersection of food and agriculture. Some crops in some places require irrigation, abstraction of surface water to the groundwater to grow. Is that a serious problem? And in particular, is it sensible to think of that as an ecosystem disservice in terms of reduction of downstream water flows or methane from rice fields or salinisation? And a further question is there a scope to mitigate this by, you've talked about spatial variability in where people live and where crops are grown, but by dealing with tariffs and barriers to trade and agricultural commodities?
Trade is already a huge compensation for local water scarcity. More water enters Egypt embedded in food than flows down the Nile. So that's a process that's already at work and is, I suppose, set to increase in future. I think what concerns me is the fragility, potentially, of that reliance on food trade to compensate for local water scarcity. I mean, we've already seen the effect of food price shocks, and one of the things we're looking at is the probability of correlated drought at different breadbasket locations around the globe, which would have an even greater effect on food prices and food trade. And to then conclude with going to the opening part of your question about food being irrigated, and there are lots of parts of the world where food is being grown in very surprising places, often for political reasons, also due to the wrong types of subsidy being in place, which is mentioned in the Commission's report. So there are issues crying out there for attention.
Yeah, we as a Commission felt extremely strongly about this question of perverse subsidies in agriculture, in energy. Not that we have anything against subsidies. We're happy with subsidies, especially for poor people. But using agricultural policies as a means is extremely perverse. Basically supports rich farmers. That was sort of a big issue. Do you want to come in, carry on going around, or why don't you stay there?
Would it be a fair summary of the panel's opinion that in order to mitigate the rate of biodiversity loss, we're at or near the sort of high water mark of consumer choice in terms of the amount of meat people eat, or I guess the time they spend in their showers, or all these things that need to happen on the demand side, if we're to stop biodiversity being lost? Thank you.
Why don't you, as the biodiversity expert, go first?
Well, I have to declare a certain bias here because I'm a vegetarian, but so I should get that out up front. But I think it is an interesting issue, but I think it also brings up the issue of behaviour. And so for example, it was quite surprising in a way to see the trouble that the Green Party had in Germany in the recent election, where they proposed, not eating meat for, giving up sausages for 1 day a week or something, and not eating meat for 1 day a week. And even in Germany, which has got a strong Green Party and is probably one of the greener countries in Europe and the world, if the Green Party can blow the election on suggesting giving up sausages for 1 day a week, then sometimes you think, oh my goodness, what hope have we got? So I think that's the interesting issue that it brings up, is this issue of behaviour. And I wonder if it's one actually that is another commonality to food, water, energy, biodiversity, all these issues, is obviously this we all, even when we're well-meaning and we want to do the right thing, we often don't. And we might need a nudge in the right direction to enable us to do that. And I know that there are some people looking at how you might, if there's the possibility to change human behaviour, but it brings up ideas about control and so on, of course.
Nudge or control?
One person's nudge is somebody else's over-controlling, right?
Okay.
That's the issue.
There's a lot of literature on nudge not working, but yeah. Anyone else want to come in on this?
We haven't heard from you for some time.
Okay, yes, I think there's almost nothing that wouldn't be made easier if we didn't reduce our consumption, which is not to say all become vegetarian by any means, because livestock in certain contexts can be beneficial for biodiversity and also have a very important role to play in low-income countries. I think, just sort of linking to the previous point, there's something to do with socio-technical transformations and behavioural lock-ins that we need to be looking at, which is about the role of technology in solving behaviours, but solving immediate problems, but creating new behavioural norms. So when you were talking about virtual water, I was reminded of for example, the growth in refrigeration dependence that we have today as a society, where all of us have refrigerators, which is a wonderful technology in it's avoiding food waste, but we waste food now because of our refrigerators rather than despite them, as they become this great big black hole. And also that if you look at our consumption of vegetables since the 1970s, the amount of vegetables that we eat has stayed more or less the same, but the kinds of vegetables we eat has changed dramatically, and we're eating those vegetables that are perhaps more water intensive, the hothouse, the vegetables, the ratatouille type vegetables and the salads. So because we have this technology which has saved energy in terms of avoidable food waste, at the same time it's created other sets of problems. And I think we really need to look at the relationship between technology and behaviour in addressing all these issues.
You've done work on carbon emissions of different animals and energy use and so on. Do you want to just give us a 2-minute summary of what we should be eating and shouldn't?
Okay. Right, well actually I was part of a DEFRA initiative called the Green Food Project, which has led precisely nowhere, but one of the things that I was tasked with doing was defining the principles of a sustainable healthy diet. And it came, you know, with a whole load of extremely sensible and not very shocking recommendations, one of which was don't eat more than you need. The other was eat a diversity of foods, another of which was moderate your meat consumption, and that was quite clearly there, and don't waste food and value it. And I think those are, but I think those broad brush recommendations, they need to be looked at in more detail.
Can you tell us which vegetables have a lower carbon footprint?
The boring ones.
Brussels sprouts.
Swedes, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Good. There's another hand.
Yeah, when you dig around in the literature on the resource stewardship, it isn't long before you come across the words adaptive management and ecological resilience contrasted with engineering, stability and so on. And particularly these words adaptive management associated with hollowing, water and Lee, people like that. So my question is this: do you think we've reached a sufficient consensus over the principles of resource stewardship that one could actually imagine putting really high quality undergraduate courses in place on this, so that right across the disciplines our budding engineers and politicians and managers of the future are actually aware of these concepts, particularly managing a system for resilience rather than just for holding it in equilibrium and maximising the yield?
I think, Jim, this is a question for you.
You're right, Chris, that there's a great literature out there, and I mean a literature with quite a long-standing pedigree, but I think then if you were to scan the whole expanse of systems thinking, you'd actually find much more attention to optimization, to getting the most out of one system than to the types of concept that you've referred to in terms of building resilience and robustness by introducing characteristics like flexibility and adaptive management. So I'd like to see a lot more of that in our educational courses, and we're doing some of that in the Environmental Change Institute. But I think also in decision making and policy circles, what I observe is actually these days lots of use of the terminology of resilience and robustness, but actually when one begins to dig down into it, not the level of kind of conceptual or theoretical basis that one might hope for and that you actually need in order to operationalize these ideas. So there's a long way to go.
Okay, gentleman over here.
Given the fact that a couple of people on the panel have noted the lack of some links and connections even in the report, which is fairly, looks fairly far into the future, and given also the wall that we might be hitting in terms of population, etc., do the panel think that in terms of their own specific areas we're going to see the changes needed before we get to this wall of population, etc., or are they do you think that we're going to have to see some fairly nasty times ahead in each of your areas before we make the changes necessary to deal?
Who'd like to go first? You're all going to speak. Tara, do you want to go first?
I think this is a really interesting question because I come from a sort of discourse that talks about mitigation and the fact that if we produce too much food, we're going to destroy the planet and make everybody morbidly obese. And on the other hand, there's the adaptation community who say if we don't do anything about it, millions are going to starve. So how do these two discourses actually, do they talk to each other? Can you have mitigation which is mindful of the adaptation and vice versa? So I think the short answer to your question, if there is one, is that the future is going to be unevenly distributed, and the spoils of the future, and that the people who are okay will probably carry on being okay, and the people who aren't won't. And there isn't a single solution, a single answer.
The only remark I'd make is this notion of an impending crunch, of some upward curve in demand and some either flat or downward curve in terms of resources which cross each other at some point in the future. And that's not the way in which things materialize either, that water resource systems are characterized by variability, and so the way in which this crunch materializes is in terms of the frequency and severity of extreme events. And that is what we're observing now. And if we're not getting a grip on managing the risks, and that's the terminology that we like to use, then we will see more severe extreme events with more damaging consequences in the future.
Well, I think, as people say, it's always difficult making forecasts, particularly about the future. But I think for biodiversity, clearly there are species in trouble. We've even had some high-profile extinctions like the river dolphin and so on recently. But on the other hand, I think the threats to there are various threats to biodiversity, and it's not quite clear how they're predicting how those will develop in the near future is not easy, and that could have a big influence on how things turn out. So, for example, worrying things are things like where you can try and protect populations of certain animals that need to have very large ranges, need a lot of space. But if you have, for example, poachers going after them because they're very desirable and so on, then that's an extremely difficult situation to try and to guard against, because it's very difficult to find the areas of land in the first place and so on. But then if you've got very motivated people going after a very small population of animals, so it depends a bit on how these various threats to biodiversity develop in the near future.
I think these people are academics hedging their bets. Yeah.
I'm afraid those answers and the ones to the question about tipping points might have been the answers to this question. This morning, it was the Today programme brought me news about acidification of the oceans, and it's not tipping points, it's lags. I'd really be interested to know where you see there might be some lags and things that we can't do it, corrective action can't be taken very easily. But the report, and I'm only looking at it down there, it says now for the long term. The Today programme brought me some pretty severe news about the lag. I just want to know what your sense of urgency is, because I don't get that sense from coming to this lecture. Will Hutton was the most energised about it, but I don't get a sense of urgency. I would walk out of here as if we were talking about something that we could possibly do something about. That's not what this report's about. It's about now, and that's not the sense I'm getting from these speakers or exception there, and other speakers to this series.
That's a good point. Okay, would anyone like to respond on that? Is this urgent? Do you have to do something now?
Yeah, I can reply. Well, it links to the time lags. I think we need to start thinking about agricultural pathways in low-income countries now, so that they don't make all the mistakes that we've made and then have to come back down. So I think we need to start planning for overconsumption in low-income countries right now, which sounds like an almost abhorrent thing to say when, I don't know, 1 in 4 children in India are malnourished. But I think those are the sorts of things we need to think about. Of course it's urgent. Yes, and in fact I think actually with food it's an issue that is really, really engaging a lot of people, and everyone's engaging it in slightly different ways, from sort of box schemes to genetic modification. Different people have their different takes on the issue, but I think there is a recognition that it's urgent and that something needs to be done. I think the real problem is that because people have different views on what ought to be done, policymakers are too scared of confronting those views and end up doing nothing or just the minimal.
I think from the biodiversity side, actually, I've mentioned the assessment of the success or failure of the Convention for Biological Diversity already, and the conclusion there was very negative, that there'd been very little progress on slowing the rate of biodiversity loss. I think it raises the more general issue in terms of trying to talk to policymakers, general public and so on, is what is the best strategy to take, well, if there is a single strategy, but is it trying to give a great sense of urgency, but at the same time that can be, some people find that a real turn-off and not motivational at all, because it's all doom and gloom and so on. So I think it's very difficult to balance the sense of urgency without making the situation seem hopeless.
And alongside the urgency, yes, this is urgent. The report is for the long term, and I think your question about time lags and lock-ins is a very interesting and important one. One of the things we work on and concerns me a great deal is sea level rise and the effect that will have for cities worldwide. If we have a metre of sea level rise by the end of this century, which is the upper bound of the fifth assessment report projection, that means that we're locked in because of the thermal inertia in the oceans, the rate of melting of ice caps to 2, 3, 4, 5 metres of sea level rise over the following 2 or 3 centuries, which really turns things back to the question of discounting, which was one of the report's main conundra that it raised, was how do we think on those very long timescales about future generations and our responsibilities now for the type of world which we're leaving them.
Great. I think that's a good point to end the conversation on. Certainly we felt as commissioners that we did have to act now. That's why we did this thing in the first place. What's interesting to me about this commission is the range of people that signed up for it. This isn't the normal suspects of the people you'd normally read in the paper. Yeah, Nick Stern is in there and others, but this included a lot of, I would say, the elder generation of people that really caused a lot of the problems as well. And saying, we now feel a sense of urgency. Something has to be done. The system is gridlocked, and unless we act now, it actually escalates. And everything you look at escalates over time with these lags. Climate change obviously does, but so does the problem of having youth unemployed, or cyber, or antibiotic resistance, or any of the issues we've been talking about. So they will become more intractable over time, which places a huge responsibility on us. The other thing that the report points out, which we think is unusual, is we actually understand this stuff. In other words, we're the first generation that understands the implications of our actions in the longer term. Come back to us in conversation, and that's why there's a particular responsibility on us to act. We cannot claim ignorance, which has always been a very convenient excuse in the past not to act. And we certainly discount the views of those that say, for example, on climate change, that we don't know. We do know. We just don't know the impact. There's a continuing series of seminars on this. So do come back next Thursday for Simon Caney on governance and future generations. The week after that is going to be the seminar on health issues. Someone raised the question on health with John Frater, who's the Principal Investigator of Emerging Infections Group, Adrian Hill, who's the co-director of our vaccines group, and Andrew Pollard, who's co-director on that. And then the final one will be on December the 5th with Sir John Beddington, who's our advisor and the former chief scientist, and Martin Rees, who's the former president of the Royal Society and was one of the commissioners on this. And then we have some other events that I'd encourage you to come to. Tomorrow here at 5 o'clock we have Professor Robert Rogers, who's a renowned professor of psychology on cognitive neuroscience, on serotonin and the influences on social norms in resource dilemmas. So it's related to this and how people's behavior might be changed. So it's going to be absolutely fascinating. And then on the 26th of November, we have a session, Jim, which I hope you might be able to come to too, because I think it will be of interest to you, from 12:30 to 2 from the World Bank on managing risk. And their latest big report that they do, their annual report, is on risk and resilience. And it's the team that wrote the report that's coming to present it here at 12:30 on the 26th. And then on the 3rd of December, we have Sir Mark Walport, who's the current chief scientist who replaced John Goldin, talking about big data. So, an action-packed term. Thank you for coming, and hope to see you again. Thank you.